So I have a little bit more theory. Are you guys up for more theory about where narcissism comes from and what it is, and then how to work with the systems approach? Okay, this is big stuff, but basically I got really fascinated by this idea of like why narcissism is becoming so prevalent in our time, so prevalent, so popular, so spoken about. And so I started researching it, and here's a little theory that I put together. So basically, you think that we've been gone through this very kind of collective, cultural, historical process of individuation, right? So there's been this breakdown of closed cultural systems, and that we let that all go in order to focus on the development of the individual, right? And that this individual has a relatively undefined path through society and through time relative to previously. You know, before it's like if your dad was a baker, you would be a baker. If your dad was a baker and you were a female, you would be married to a baker. You know, you wouldn't leave the village where you were born. Like things were very class stratified and very social structure set, so that there wasn't this need for in a single person to define their life path in the way that there is now. So there's this huge emphasis in our times that is being placed on becoming oneself in the world, right? Who am I? What am I doing with my life? And we kind of have this version of what a life path is supposed to look like, especially in the United States, where you discover your specialness, actually. And then you work really hard to find a career that will give you money within capitalism to reward you in the special position that you've created for yourself based on sharing your gifts and making an impact, right? And that this will allow you safety, survival, a social network, all that kinds of things. So part of growing up now and moving forward into this completely unknown future, into this completely unknown, ever-changing world, is that each individual needs to be asking themselves these questions. Who am I, and what am I going to do with my life? And just to emphasize that these are very different questions, right? Who am I? Who am I as a psycho-spiritual human being is a very different question than what am I doing with my life within, you know, for example, in the United States in 2018 within capitalism, right? And so you can see that there's this split that happens, that there's almost a confusion that occurs between conscious awareness of who am I? What does it mean to be a human being? What is consciousness? What is life, right? These like deep philosophical questions that people have been asking, with this very social self of what am I doing with my life? Who am I at the level of my social being? And Martin Buber, I'm going to reference, wrote this book called I and Now. He was a German philosopher from the early 1900s. And he says that he wrote this book called It and Thou. And this idea that when people say the word I, there's a split in the word I. And one is I, it. So you're talking about I or me as a social object. You mean your social demographics, you mean what you do for a living, you mean, you know, anything that we would say in process work is consensus reality. You have this I, it. I as object. You self-objectify yourself and then fit yourself within a context of other objects. I live in this place. I have this partner. I do this for a living, right? I look like this. Which is very different than I, thou, which is more what we would call the essence level or the dreaming level, where I is connected in this sort of ongoing, ever unfolding, somewhat mysterious process that's also inherently relational, that's very subjective, that's ever changing, that has no discrete boundaries, right? Where I am a mystery. I'm an ever unfolding mystery that seems to be in relationship with all of these other things in a way that's unclear to me and in way in which I am you and you are me and we're all part of something, is more this I thou process that's happening beneath it. So that what happens in this confusion between this focus on individuality is that I, the social object of me, and I, thou, the sort of psycho-spiritual process of me, becomes confused and conflated. And that the emphasis actually becomes on the social self due to, I think, just like the persistent reality of consensus aspects due to the demands of capitalism. We actually have to individuate in order to survive. So who am I in terms of I, thou, the spiritual process, is less important in a day-to-day level as what am I doing with my life, right? And so one kind of swallows the other. And we start locating our sense of self within external contexts. And the thing is, if you start saying, who am I, what am I doing with my life, means my job, my friends, my partner, my whatever, what I look like, then you're going to start needing validation from those external contexts, right? And the world is really scary. Things are really not guaranteed. You know, if you love someone, that could end at any moment. Just being alive itself could end at any moment. So I think this sort of fear develops if you're looking to other people for validation, if you're looking to other people for who you are, if you're looking other people to give you love and security and a sense of yourself, like we all are, you know, there's a fundamental insecurity. And so it leads to developing strategies to control and ensure the reception of love. So really what I think narcissism and codependency are these constellations of traits and behaviors that describe two different polarities on the same axis that have been developed in order to control and ensure love. And I'm saying love, you know, some people talk about it in terms of belonging or safety or power or status, but I think really you kind of strip all of those away and it comes down to like love and safety. So I think the strategies that have developed have to do with seeing the self as an object. So narcissism is seeing yourself as an object and attempting to use that object in order to control people around you to ensure love, right? And this is where you get into gaslighting. If people don't respect me, then I will bully them. I will use my status, I will use my specialness, I will use my whatever to get them to respect and love me, right? Or, so I'm using my objects to change those around me. This person is talking back to me. I'm going to use my power to stop it. Yeah? You don't have a right to feel that way. Whereas on the other end of codependency, you tend to modulate the object of yourself in order to ensure that love. So, when I bake them cookies, they love me more. I'll bake them cookies. They didn't like me talking back to them. I won't talk back to them. But the thing about this, that it perpetuates that fundamental insecurity because you're still receiving validation and love completely dependent on external context and only for yourself as an object of love, right? It's not touching that real deep relating that comes from I, thou. Okay. So that's a lot. I'm gonna finish up this part of things. But I guess, yeah, I want to pause and see if anyone has any questions or comments so far. Okay. There's one little piece of this which I think is more about kind of the evolutionary development of these dynamics, and then more about narcissism and codependency itself. Because there is sort of like this evolutionary impulse towards individuation and individuality, right? And I do think it's part of the movement of consciousness itself. Like, this has happened to consciousness. This has happened to social organization, and it's part of an evolutionary process that we're in. And that this tension that we're experiencing actually between the social self, I, it, or the creation of individuality, and then the structures of attention, awareness, that I, thou, the one that watches ourselves create individuality, is part of the movement forwards. So it's part of us being able to come to our wholeness, and it's part of the liberation of life force energy itself. And actually, the tension that we're experiencing between who am I as a social object, am I getting the love that I need? And then the one that observes it, the one that observes all the things that we do in order to try and attain love. The extent to which we can manage this tension is indicative of where we are locating our sense of self in any given moment. So I am just a social object who is either getting or not getting love, versus I, thou. I am like a conscious participant, or a part of my consciousness that is aware of myself playing in strategies. Where we are in that spectrum is part of our ability to be able to transcend these qualities by relocating our sense of self away from the social object and the sort of terror and fear and strategy that's employing, and more kind of back into a deeper structure of our consciousness that can watch ourselves, hopefully with curiosity, with non-judgment, with love and respect for what's happening. So does that make sense to people at all? Might be a little bit out there. But I think just the basic idea where it's like we have social self, and then we have this other thing in our consciousness. And it's normally the social self that feels incredibly threatened, and the social self that's attempting to objectify itself or the other in order to get love. Nandi says yes. Okay. And the last bit of theory that I want to bring in here is this idea of Wilhelm Reich, who I love, and orgone energy. So let me see if I can share my screen with you guys here, because this has been one of the most useful things when it comes to really understanding narcissism and codependency for me. And it's just this little model right here. So basically this idea that we come from a sense of wholeness, and that because of the things we go through in our life, because of our mythic patterns, because of whatever, we have this place where our energy splits, right? This can be during trauma. This can be during social conditioning processes, wherever. Something in us comes out and it splits. And part of it goes towards repression, and part of it goes towards expression. And that between those two is a block. So what I think is very cool is understanding that these are basically tendencies within the psyche. Excuse me. And that narcissisms will lean towards expression. And that, so they'll express big emotions, they'll express their sense of self, rah, 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 express. And codependents will lean towards repression. I can't say my emotions, I gotta hold it in. I can't even have a reaction to what someone is doing to me, and I'm just gonna repress it down and put on my smiley face, right? But that what's interesting to me is that the block or the edge between the two is self-objectification. That whether you repress or express, it's because you have an idea in your head of your social object and how you need to modulate or change or assert that social object in order to get your self-love. So when I'm codependent, for example, I will do a lot of things where, oh, I'll be very nice, and always ask how they're doing. And, oh, change my behavior depending on what they like in order to get love. When I'm being narcissistic, I might get really like loud and proud and like dress a certain way and talk myself up a certain way to make my social object seem a certain way in order to get love. But both are self-objectification and both are inherently unstable, right? It's going to be very hard to actually feel any sort of safety in getting love in that way because, nothing outside is ever guaranteed. No matter how you assert or modulate or change your social object, you can never promise that people are going to love you. So pulling back from the strategy of what do I do in order to get love is in and of itself anchoring in an awareness that's closer to that energy split, right? Just noticing, what do I do to get love is already coming back, anchoring in I thou, anchoring in the self-awareness process. What do I do when I feel scared? What do I do when I feel threatened? Noticing that self is kind of getting into your own deeper awareness that can see and hold you. And then being like, oh, where do I repress, right? Where do I repress my emotions? Or where do I express my emotions and not notice the other person, right? Getting back to those places to liberate where we express, and then to maybe actually not just be completely hijacked by our emotions in the moment and actually being able to repress long enough to notice others. So sort of working that seesaw is actually liberating your life force energy. Because ultimately being able to both express and repress with healthy awareness is part of what leads to the liberation. It's part of what leads to wholeness. And when you can really witness yourself and your tendencies and value them, you can find that there's essential gifts. Both have gifts inside. And actually, if you repress more, there's like a lot of gifts to find in expressing. If you express more, there's a lot of gifts to find in repressing. And really how much you can anchor in being aware of yourself, no matter what you're doing, is really valuable.